Portuguese colonialism in Africa lasted 505 years, from 1470 to 1975. The Portuguese colonized six African countries: Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Sao Tome and Principe, and Equatorial Guinea. These countries are known as Lusophone countries, as Portuguese is their official language. The Portuguese were among the first European powers to establish trade routes along the west coast of Africa in the 15th century. The era of formal colonization began with the establishment of Portuguese forts and trading posts. In the case of specific territories, Portuguese colonial rule in Angola began in the late 15th century, while Mozambique came under Portuguese influence in the early 16th century. The Cape Verde Islands, Guinea-Bissau, and Sao Tome and Principe were also part of the Portuguese colonial empire in Africa. In Equatorial Guinea, Portugal's colonial presence was relatively limited compared to other European powers, and the region was primarily influenced by Spain and France. However, there were some Portuguese efforts to establish a presence in Equatorial Guinea. In the late 15th century, Portuguese explorer Fernando Po explored the Gulf of Guinea, including the islands of Sao Tome and Principe. While Sao Tome and Principe became significant Portuguese colonies, the mainland areas of what is now Equatorial Guinea were largely bypassed by the Portuguese in terms of substantial colonization. The Portuguese did establish some trading posts and forts along the coast of Equatorial Guinea, but their presence remained relatively minor. The Spanish and French later became more dominant in the region, with Spain ultimately taking control of Equatorial Guinea in the late 19th century through the treaties of Paris in 1900 and Bata in 1902, solidifying its colonial rule. Equatorial Guinea gained independence from Spain on October 12, 1968, and it is important to note that Portuguese colonial influence in the region was not as significant as that of other European powers. However, the process of stamping out Portuguese colonialism in Africa gained momentum in the mid-20th century, particularly after World War II, and African nations started gaining independence. Guinea-Bissau gained its independence in 1973, while Angola, Cape Verde or Cabo Verde, Mozambique, and Sao Tome and Principe achieved independence in 1975, marking the end of Portuguese colonialism in Africa. In the 15th century, Portuguese sailors pioneered a sea route around Africa to reach Asia and the East Indies. Establishing outposts along the West African coast, they gradually extended their influence, reaching the Congo River in 1482 and rounding the Cape of Good Hope in 1497. Vasco da Gama's voyage to India in 1498 marked a significant milestone. Portugal encountered sophisticated civilizations, with control limited to coastal forts safeguarding trade and alliances with local leaders. The introduction of the slave trade in Angola triggered warfare, depopulation, and turmoil inland. For 200 years, Africa served primarily as an outpost on the route to India for Portugal. Only when setbacks occurred in the Eastern Empire did serious attention turn to the African interior with a quest for gold and silver. African uprisings persisted on both coasts well into the 20th century, and Portugal only established control after other European powers had already set the precedent with greater colonial strength and stability. Expanding across Africa, the Portuguese subjugated Islamic cities in Mozambique and seized key ports. They also established bases in India, the East Indies, China, and Japan, dominating European trade with Asia. Despite their focus on Asian trade, the Portuguese found significant profit in African gold, ivory, and slave trade. After King Sebastian died in 1578, Portuguese ambitions were overshadowed by Spanish rule. The decline continued as Dutch and British powers rose, leading to the loss of commercial bases. By the late 18th century, Portugal retained only small colonies in West Africa and undeveloped territories in Southern Africa. During the Napoleonic era, Portugal faced instability, with the royal family relocating to Brazil. Post-Brazilian independence in 1822, Portugal focused on developing Southern African colonies to protect against European competition, and the Berlin Conference in 1884 and 1885 pressured Portugal to demonstrate control over Angola and Mozambique. Over 40 years, Portugal waged a military campaign to subjugate native African populations, declaring Angola pacified in 1922. However, armed resistance persisted, especially among the Bakongo and Mbundi people in northern Angola. The process of pacification displaced native Africans, compelling many into forced labor on extensive coffee plantations. In Angola, mixed-race Creoles thrived initially under Portuguese rule but lost influence as resistance grew. In Mozambique, Portugal's attempt to control the interior failed, leading to economic concessions. The dictatorial regime of Antonio Salazar in Portugal repressed African demands, turning native insurgencies into Cold War proxy conflicts. In Angola, 3 independence movements emerged, while Frelimo dominated Mozambique's insurgency. After Salazar's regime fell in 1974, Angola and Mozambique faced devastation as external powers fueled anarchic conflicts in the newly independent states. Similarly, Portugal's West African colonies, diminished after the end of the slave trade, struggled with cycles of drought and starvation. The Cape Verde Islands became a province in 1951, offering educational opportunities. This led to the emergence of an independent movement, with active insurgency beginning in Guinea-Bissau in 1963. Over a decade later, Portugal's African colonies gained independence, marking the collapse of the Salazar regime. In the quest for valuable commodities like fabrics, spices, and gold, Europeans sought a quicker route to South Asia. This pursuit led the Portuguese along the West African coast to Sierra Leone in 1460, where their technological prowess and cultural advantages dominated world trade for nearly 2 centuries. Shielded from the Black Plague, Portugal's strong national identity and economic resources fueled ambitious explorations. Exposure to Islam enriched Portugal's maritime capabilities, resulting in a fleet adept at navigating the Atlantic. Between 1415 and the 1600s, the West African coast was extensively explored, revealing an accurate understanding of its intricate geography. African exploits included gold, ivory, pepper, and over 175,000 slaves. By 1600, Dutch and English involvement exponentially increased the scale of the slave trade. From their arrival in Sierra Leone in the mid-15th century until their decline in the 16th century, the Portuguese had a complex relationship with African trading partners. Exploring cities comparable to Lisbon in complexity, they found West African urban centers governed by dynasties, organized guilds, and advanced agriculture. Many African cities surpassed their European counterparts in size, hygiene, and organization. Shared beliefs in magic, the supernatural, and illness treatment fostered common ground between Portuguese and African societies. The Portuguese land policy aimed to encourage European settlement in the colonies through land concessions and settlement schemes. This strategy not only sought to optimize land use for the entire population, but also aimed to bolster European control. Annually, around 12,000 settlers entered Angola, with a smaller number in Mozambique, driven in part by poverty in Portugal. The land policy strongly favored the settlers, as evidenced by Europeans occupying, on average, 60 times more land in Angola than Africans. In the grip of Portuguese colonial rule, 11 million Africans endured hardship across an expanse of 2 million square kilometers, larger than Spain, France, Germany, Italy, and England combined. Despite abundant natural resources like iron, coal, oil, diamonds, and gold, the African population faced a subhuman existence, reminiscent on serfdom, in a land rich in potential but shackled by exploitation. The potentially prosperous colonies of Angola and Mozambique fulfilled the conventional colonial role of supplying the mother country with raw materials, accessing external markets, and contributing foreign exchange due to their economic richness. Primary agricultural products, predominantly controlled by Europeans, constituted the major export earnings. In Angola, these included coffee, sisal, maize, cotton, and sugar, while in Mozambique, cotton, cashew, sugar, copra, sisal, and tea. Angola derived additional earnings from mining, while Mozambique's supplementary income came from transportation, port, and by rail. Angola possessed valuable resources like oil, diamonds, and iron ore, offering significant potential for economic development. However, industrialization in both territories remained minimal, limited to some processing of primary products and light manufacturing for local consumption. Reacting to global opinion, Portugal made changes such as opening the territories to foreign investment. Portugal's resources were insufficient for full exploitation of the colony's natural wealth or economic diversification. It was not until 1965, amid war expenditures draining Portugal's resources and highlighting the backwardness of colonial economies, that foreign investment was actively encouraged. Later, foreign investment focused on mining, including oil, processing of agricultural and fishery products, and land plantation ownership. Angola and Mozambique increased their share of the global export market and benefited from expanded infrastructure, including hydroelectric and irrigation projects. After enduring the hardship of slavery, conquest and colonial wars, African society faced a devastating blow to its economic and social fabric. European occupation and a surge in European immigration followed, resulting in the plunder of African lands and possessions. The Portuguese imposed a sovereignty tax while exerting control through forced labor and the export of African workers. As the European population swelled, disdain for Africans grew. Employment opportunities were limited and racial discrimination became overt or implicit. Africans were displaced from fertile regions for European settlements and basic human rights were denied. The United Nations Charter prompted a hurried change in the Portuguese constitution, relabeling colonies as overseas territories to avoid accountability for their actions in Africa. Portuguese colonialism ended later than most European powers, unraveling after the 1974 bloodless coup that ended Salazar's reign. The overthrow not only ended right-wing control, but also led to Portugal's withdrawal from its remaining African colonies. In contrast to their European counterparts, Portuguese rulers were adamant in resisting the calls for self-determination in their overseas territories. This led to a prolonged conflict spanning from 1961 to 1974 in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique. Lisbon's reluctance to embrace the winds of change in Africa can be attributed to various factors, including the belief that Portugal lacked the means for a successful exit strategy and the dictatorial nature of Salazar's new state, which stifled open debates on the cost of maintaining an empire. Despite Cold War alliances and secret agreements with Rhodesia and South Africa, Portugal managed to withstand armed insurgencies through a combination of divide and rule tactics, population control schemes, and development efforts. However, this unwavering stance had its consequences as the military grew dissatisfied with a prolonged stalemate. In April 1974, a military coup ended 50 years of authoritarian rule in Portugal, paving the way for the power transitions in the 5 Lusophone African territories. The ensuing transition, marked by political inexperience in Lisbon, the resistance of white settler groups, divisions among African nationalists, and foreign interference, unfolded in a disorderly fashion. Here are 10 facts you did not know about Portuguese colonialism in Africa. One, Portuguese explorers including Vasco da Gama and Bartolomeu Dias played a key role in opening sea routes to Africa in the 15th century. They established trading posts and forts along the west and east coast of the continent. 2. Portugal was one of the first European powers to engage in formal colonial activities in Africa, beginning with the establishment of trading posts in the early 15th century. 3. Portugal played a significant role in the Atlantic slave trade, transporting millions of African slaves to the Americas. The Portuguese were involved in slave trading from various points along the African coast. 4. The São Tomé and Príncipe Islands off the west coast of Africa were important Portuguese colonies. They became major centers for sugar and later cocoa production, relying heavily on African slave labor. 5. Portugal's presence in Africa included the colonization of Angola and Mozambique, where they established settlements, engaged in trade, and exploited resources such as minerals and timber. 6. Portuguese colonialism left a lasting cultural impact on many African nations. The Portuguese language and Catholicism, introduced during the colonial period, continue to be influential in countries like Angola and Mozambique. 7. African resistance to Portuguese colonial rule took various forms. The Angolan War of Independence, 1961 to 1974, and the Mozambican War of Independence, 1964 to 1974, were notable armed conflicts seeking to end Portuguese colonial domination. 8. The Carnation Revolution in Portugal in 1974 marked the beginning of the end of Portuguese colonialism in Africa. This event led to a series of negotiations and transitions, resulting in the independence of several African nations, including Angola and Mozambique, in 1975. 9. Guinea-Bissau, another former Portuguese colony in Africa, unilaterally declared independence in 1973, preceding Portugal's formal recognition of its independence in 1974. 10. Portuguese colonialism in Africa stood on pillars of coercive labor and tax exactions, racial discrimination, authoritarian politics, and economic exploitation. The legacy of Portuguese colonialism in Africa reverberates through time, leaving a multifaceted impact on the cultural, economic, and political fabric of the regions that were once under Portuguese influence. Despite not being as extensive as other European colonial powers, Portugal's historical presence in Africa has left enduring marks. Economically, the exploitation of natural resources and the establishment of trade networks played a significant role in shaping the economic landscape. While some regions experienced development, others grappled with the repercussions of resource depletion and economic exploitation, contributing to lasting economic disparities. Socially, the colonial period left a lasting impact on social structures and ethnic dynamics. Hierarchies established during this time persist in some societies, influencing contemporary social relationships and power structures. Infrastructure and architecture from the colonial era serve as tangible reminders of Portuguese presence, contributing to the visual landscape of many African nations. The forts, buildings, and roads constructed during this period continue to stand as historical markers. The Portuguese language, introduced during colonial rule, remains prevalent in several African countries. Additionally, the spread of Catholicism has left a lasting religious influence, shaping spiritual practices and belief systems. Political institutions in post-colonial nations bear the imprint of colonial legacies, as administrative structures established during the Portuguese colonial period influence the formation of modern political systems. The struggle for independence and subsequent nation-building processes were deeply shaped by the colonial past. Despite the cultural exchange and hybridity that occurred during Portuguese colonialism, challenges persist in regions marked by this history. Ongoing issues related to governance, ethnic tensions, and economic development require a nuanced understanding of the complex legacy of Portuguese colonialism to foster reconciliation, development, and a more equitable future for these nations.